the fortress in the east. It was almost dawn when the Sumiks reached the west river of Garadia. Even at dark the soldiers worked on their equipment at the banks. The piles of woods on the carriages were immediately unloaded and were made into floating rafts where they loaded the horses, catapults and trebuchets. Yugada looked at his map. If we go straight from Garadia to the other side of this river, we will be at the tip of this land. Yugada was pointing to the tip of the land across the river from the southwest of Garadia. This is not good. We cannot concentrate all our forces in a small area, and if we get ambushed we will be in a disadvantage. Some of us must sail further south. Yugada's finger was running on the narrowing river passing the lands of Simphus. We will scatter our forces at the shores of this land and we will attack from here to here. The areas that Yugada was describing were from the shores perpendicular to the middle of Simphus to the southern edges of Garadia. Omer, you lead the soldiers in the northern tip while I will sail further south. Omer studied the map and looked at what Yugada was pointing to. He gave a nod and left. He called upon the leaders of his battalion and gave them instructions. Moments later, the large army was moving. A few soldiers rode on boats and canoes heading directly to the other side of the great river. A few Nugas were with them. They would serve as scouts. The others prepared the small boats that they carried and filled it up with soldiers. The Garadians lent their few larger boats to load other soldiers. Yugada, Leonardo and 5,000 soldiers began their sail southwards. In the stillness of the river water and the night the army sailed in their respective destinations. Everyone was aware of the danger in crossing the river of Garadia to the other land, for the Garadians had told them on their war in the past. While on the waters everyone was quiet, each was looking at the dark water for any movement or signs that the enemy may attack from under. Omer's group was the first to reach the shores of the unknown land. The river bank was vast and straight, providing each soldier a complete view of all their forces as Yugada and the others continued their sail down south. The group of Yugada and Leonardo just passed the edges of the Simphus forest. It was the first time that Leonardo saw the mythical woods from the river. Inside, he could see colorful and flashing lights. The Sumik soldiers were also seeing it as they silently rowed their boats. The forest seemed to be illuminating at times and emitting different colors, the same colors that Leonardo was seeing from the sky in the east when he was still living in the rock hole at Mathippus. Just as when they were deep inside the waters of Simphus, they were disturbed by something coming from the inside of its forest. They heard several rumblings like 1,000 horses were running from the woods towards the river where they were. The soldiers immediately prepared their weapons and all were looking at the dark forest of Simphus. They heard the fading voices of several horses, but none was appearing as they stared towards the dark woods waiting for something to come out. No one seemed to be breathing. Then, the sounds disappeared. They waited. There was nothing. Simphus is always like that, Nala shivering remarked. His right hand was shaking, tucked beside his waist holding a cold metal dagger. That is why it is not good to be here. Yugada himself heard the noises and felt scared for the first time in his life. He had fought in great battles before, but Simphus sent chill down to his bones. Moments later the boats changed direction and headed towards the bank of the river at the other side of Simphus. They were not looking at the land ahead but on their back where Simphus was, as if something would come out from there any time they turned their backs on it. But there was none but the swaying of the branches of the trees. Yugada's forces docked at the bank and everybody quietly alighted from their boats. They saw the entire bank of the land filled with soldiers. Leonardo remained still and could not keep himself from looking at Simphus. He seemed to see a tall illuminating figure walking inside its woods. Did you see that? Yugada turned around and stared to where Leonardo was looking. What? The figure disappeared. Don't let your eyes fool you. There is something evil in that land. Nala was always there giving side comments and consciousness about the eeriness in the air. Their attention was disturbed when scouts appeared from the woods. The Nugas. The Nugas told their find. It was then that Yugada, Leonardo and the rest focused on the land before them as the Nugas described the woods ahead. They listened intently. Then, Yugada gave the command extending up to the entire length of the river bank to the north where Omer and his soldiers were waiting for his order. They moved inside the woods following the Nugas. The Nugas' black bodies made them completely invisible in the dark as the soldiers and warriors tailed from behind following the glowing piece of wood that each of the Nugas was holding. A Nugas signaled the army behind them to stop as other Nugas went deeply inside the woods. Yugada and the soldiers waited. Moments later, the Nugas returned and signaled for them to follow. Quietly, the soldiers walked a little farther into the woods to where the Nugas were as they showed them the fortress. The Nugas described to Yugada where the highest concentration of the Malservius was. Then, Yugada sent the message that passed on from one soldier to another, reaching Omer's battalion. They all understood his orders. From where they were positioned, they did not even cover half of the fortress. One by one, the soldiers took their respective places as the catapults and trebuchets were readied and loaded with their deadly missiles. They were seeing a few Malservius on top of the fortress, but the long south side was empty. When Yegeda learnt that the soldiers were in position, he signaled the attack. Omer responded and sent a few hundred soldiers near the walls. The sky then was lit up and the ground shook as the armored Sumiks emerged from the woods and marched towards the fortress. The missiles from the catapults and trebuchets were ahead of the advancing army. The Malservius were caught by surprise seeing a large force of armed soldiers and warriors heading towards them while the sky was filled with flying sticks and burning chaos heading towards them. They tried to alarm the others and took positions to defend, but it was too late. The missiles hit many of them just as they were preparing. Their archers positioned on top, but before they could release their arrows, the advanced scouts of the Sumiks near the walls fired their crossbows at them. The bodies of Malservius were falling from the top of the fortress as the scouts were taking out the archers one by one. Their top defenses were falling apart and their grounds were being filled up by the missiles from the trebuchets and catapults. Some tried to run away to the woods, but they were unlucky to avoid the long-range arms of the Sumiks. A few moments later, the top of the fortress was cleared as Yegeda's large army continued their advance. Omer ordered several hundred Sumiks to climb the walls and clear the ground behind the fortress as he ordered the missile throwers to cease firing when the soldiers began to scale the walls. The soldiers started to shoot arrows from the top of the fortress towards the ground as several screams from the remaining Malservius echoed in the air. The smoke was rising out until moments later the climbers signaled that it was clear behind the fortress. Yegeda stopped their advance when he saw Sumik soldiers went down on the other side of the wall. They were standing by in front of its huge and wide door, the fortress' lone entrance. Yegeda and Leonardo were surprised that there was not much resistance on the fortress. They were expecting that the wide door would release thousands of defenders. That did not happen, but instead saw the door opened by the Sumik soldiers pushing it outwards towards them. It took 100 hands to push each door as the grounds inside revealed fire and smoke with several bodies of slain Malservius laid dead. There were a few wounded who were crawling that the soldiers immediately gathered as prisoners. Something is not right. Nala, who was behind Yegeda and Leonardo, trembling, remarked. What do you mean? Yegeda asked. We fought them in the past in the river back there. Our survivors told that there were thousands of them. Not just them. Nala's worried look was gazing at Yegeda. Yegeda knew what Nala was saying. The bodies of the guards of the fortress were no more than 200 in all. The clear sky was already providing light on the empty large space before them as they entered the doors and saw that both ends of the long fortress were clear of any enemy. Not one Malservia was present except those who were at the gates that they destroyed. I don't like this, Nala remarked. Yegeda and the soldiers with him in the past felt the same as Nala. They do not trust the stillness and silence around them, as if something is going to happen any moment. They waited for any sign of movement from the sloping woods from afar, but none was happening. Yegeda ordered a few soldiers to advance through the hills while they all waited in defense formation. Their whole force was now inside the fortress. Moments later, the soldiers returned, motioning that the hills and the woods before them were cleared of enemies. It was then that Yegeda breathed out and ordered Omer to come to his side. He then looked at the Geradians. Anik, you did well. You can go back to the river. We can carry on from here. Watch the waters back there and tell us if Malservius are coming from that side. We do not want to be surprised. We will go and march towards the woods. Anik nodded as Omer came to Yegeda's side. Yegeda got his map again while Leonardo looked on. This is probably where the Mals are. Yegeda was pointing to an open space in the map that was surrounded by very thick woods and the rainforest. After this hill is the rainforest. It looks like a long journey from here. We must send the Nugas to see what is ahead of us. Leonardo was listening and staring at the map. We will take this side and we still need the boats, Leonardo remarked. What do you mean? His map was not seeing any waters leading to the lake but plain woods. There is another river that we need to cross after the hills before us. Leonardo's finger began to run at the map. As you can see, this part is where the river from the north was flowing and surely, it must go out, but your map is not showing it. It just ended here. Leonardo was right. Yegeda's map showed the path of the great river to the north that just stopped as it hit the northern rainforest. This area is where the high cliffs are and the waters from the great river flowed here as waterfalls. There are Malservius camping there and these waterfalls flow towards here and ran parallel to the river we just crossed back there. Yegeda was confused at what Leonardo just told. Are you sure? Have you seen it? Yegeda asked. No, I mean yes. My friends were lost there once and told me about this place. It is just a short river, but we still need boats and the rafts to carry the weapons in case. I was told there is a bridge that connects the land before us to the other side before we touch the rainforest. I don't think the bridge can carry our weapons or our large soldiers if we will try to use it. It was designed for the Mals and the Malservius alone. Yugita's face was changing hearing the information from Leonardo. He did not expect another river before them. Omer, Yugita turned his face towards Omer, who was seriously listening. Tell the soldiers to bring the rafts and the boats here. I will go with them, said Leonardo. Yugita looked at Leonardo. He was balancing whether he wanted Leonardo to be out of his sight. I will be fine, Leonardo reassuringly remarked. Yugita knew that there was no more imminent danger from where they came and that the Geradians were going back to the river in the east, plus a few hundred soldiers were left in the river bank to guard their boats. He felt his king would be safe. He agreed but still ordered Drund, an Ibith officer, to go with him with about 100 Ibiths that Drund was commanding. You can wait for us at the river. It is not far from here. No, Leonardo. I will wait till I see you come back. Leonardo nodded, turned his back and quickly walked towards the woods behind. Yugita was watching at his king as the Ibiths walked with him. A few at the back quickly kept pace and walked ahead of him until he was surrounded by hundreds of soldiers in red armors. The river was not far, and moments later, Leonardo and the Ibiths were emerging from the woods where the Geradians and a few Sumik soldiers were settling and guarding the perimeter. When they saw him, some stood up, while the others standing raised their shields and bowed their heads. The Geradians saw the respect accorded to Leonardo. Back at Geradia, they were already looking at him, for he was the only one different from the others. Not only that he was the only one with a golden hair with streak of red, but also for Leonardo's clothes that was different from the soldiers. He was still wearing the protective vest made by Kay, and the lone one not carrying any weapon with him. The Geradians sensed he is not a soldier, and they felt that though Yugita leads the large army, Leonardo is somebody much higher than him, for the red armored soldiers were always with him and Yugita always looked for him. Quickly, Leonardo told the soldiers to pull the small boats and canoes while he helped out in the dismantling of the wooden rafts. One by one, the soldiers pulled the loose logs towards the woods and the Geradians helped out. They left the horses and carriages at Geradia. From time to time, Leonardo would stare at Simphus that was now under the sky that was turning blue. It was one of the reasons why he wanted to help in getting the boats and to be back at the river. He wanted to see Simphus again. This time, Simphus was showing nothing unusual but like a normal forest filled with tall thick trees. As he held one of the woods dismantled from a raft, a Geradian, not far away from him, dropped to the ground. He saw a thick dark stick embedded on its body. Then, he heard several swooshing sounds as bodies fell on the soft sand. Geradians, soldiers and a few Ibiths. They were under attack. The Ibiths quickly reacted at the sight of flying arrows towards them, hitting a few Sumiks and Geradians who were not able to cover themselves with their shields. Take cover. Protect the king, Drunt shouted. The soldiers and Ibiths quickly came towards Leonardo, shields up, while the Geradians themselves took cover. The soldiers and the Ibiths were quick in covering Leonardo with their bodies and large shields. They would not allow any arrow to hit him. They positioned to defend and formed their formation where shields covered their front and top. Each shield in the front was supported by a wooden stick stuck to the ground to hold it in case the enemy clashed their front, making both their arms free to hack the enemies up front while having the shields work like a small fortress. It was a defensive stance that could advance for offense, where the inside soldiers could release their spears, swords, daggers and arrows to enemies from afar by merely lowering down their shields. In the middle was a group of 10 to 20 swordsmen that could inflict damage to an advancing army that may break any side of the formation. The front soldiers were fully covered by large shields, and so were their backs, for if they needed to turn around, the formation would still be closed. It would take boulders and rocks thrown to the formation for it to be broken, as their shields were now made of special wood that couldn't be set on fire. Onik and the Geradians were scattered on the banks of the lake as they took cover against the still unseen enemy. The Sumik soldiers who were not able to get inside the Ibith formation had their own defensive formation. The river bank had 6 groups of several soldier formations that began to move closely towards the formation where Leonardo was. They will protect their king. The Geradians started to shoot arrows inside the woods, thinking that the enemy was there. They were all confused, for nothing was on their sight but the woods and the river. Just as they were all in position, the firing of dark arrows suddenly ceased and silence filled them all. Leonardo was in the midst of the Ibiths. He could only see their backs, the red clothes, side daggers, swords held by hands and the back end of the raised shields in the air. They were together in the wide open shores of the river. Then, Drunt's voice filled the air. Soldiers, prepare to advance. It was an order for them to move towards the woods to join Yugita and Omer. Just as they were about to move, dark bodies rose up from the river and simultaneously, dusts flew out in the air as the grounds inside the woods opened, releasing the dark enemies. The Malservius had surrounded them.